And a lot of the time coaches will just say, well, if you can't trust yourself around it, just don't have it in-house. And that's, again, another big red flag, because what that does is it triggers what we call the abstinence violation effect, which is a kind of thought process that was originally proposed for people with addictions.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today I am joined by Dr Emilia Thompson, and it's been what a journey it has been to get you on here. We've both just had catastrophic failures with technology over the last couple of weeks trying to get this sorted. But Emilia is a really interesting person, and I wanted to get her on here to talk about disordered eating and how to improve relationships with food. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me 18 times. Hopefully this time will be the one.
Yeah. So I think we've recorded the intro numerous times, like you said, but not got much further than that due to the technology failures and the teething issues with these new systems that I'm using. But what I really wanted to do, I really wanted to get on and talk about this, all the disordered eating habits and how clearly you communicate that on your social media with the posts that you do around an awareness of self and food and just habitual behavior. I guess that the logical starting point would be, where did that all begin for you?
Good question. So I've always had disordered eating habits since I was about 16. I kind of spent 15 years trying to stay as small as possible. I was a proper millennial woman, obsessed with Kate Moss. Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels, that type of vibe, as I think a lot of people probably can relate to. And I eventually fell into competing in bikini in about 2014. I competed for 4.5 years, and for me, competing was a space where I could have what looked like a healthy control. It was just another way of restricting, but it was done as a sport and it was glorified, right? And I could get even leaner than I already was, and it would be celebrated. And so I started competing, and at the same time, academically, I was a lecturer in sport nutrition. So my background is, I had a master's in nutrition and a PhD in exercise physiology. And so I was teaching sport nutrition. So I had all the research background of dieting and training, etc. And when I started competing, I realised actually when you compete, it often exacerbates any of the issues that you've already got, if not then creating more that you didn't already have. And so I did my first show and like comp prep, and had a coach for my first one, and then after that I did it myself. But the first one, I realised after my first show that I was binge eating. I was using exercise. I was training twice a day because I felt guilty for the extra food that I was eating. I felt lost. I hated my training. I really struggled. And it was 2014, and because you competed around the same time, that nobody spoke about it. Nobody said, oh, this sometimes happens when you compete, and nobody was honest, and they just said, oh, I'm doing fine, like let's just grind harder. And I just remember thinking, this can't just be me. Like, it can't just be me that's got such a crap relationship with food now. So I kind of just delved into the research, because I was a scientist, or I'm a scientist. I fell into the research around extreme dieting and how that impacts your relationship with food. Because even like everyone talks about relationship with food now, but back then nobody even knew that they had a relationship with food, let alone a bad one or a good one. So I was just kind of like, well, let me see what I can find in terms of general diets, and found actually that it's super common, and started writing about it a lot and doing blogs and Instagram and things like that. And then I realised actually most people were going through it. It's just that most people didn't know that they could talk about it. And then I just kind of fell into more and more, and that kind of created a space that I now sit in.
It's so strange going back to that like 2014 era, thinking about it, because as you said, like social media is a highlight reel anyway. But I think when I was competing at the similar time that you were, there was a very definite like ethos of, grind harder than me. And it was, work harder, not necessarily even smarter, just keep grinding, keep working, that kind of old school bodybuilding ethos that just is, not all of it is just ridiculously unhealthy, but it depends on the way that it's framed. And I remember competitors, friends, whatever, who were you know, putting stuff out on their social medias about how they were still being super strict. And I knew personally that they were really struggling with their eating behaviors because they were binging. Then they were like, you know, then they were trying to compensate and over exercise because similar situation. And I remember my first competition afterwards, I did the stereotypical thing. I got an old school bodybuilding coach and he put me on chicken, rice and broccoli for like 6 months. And then at the end of it, I was like going absolutely nuts. I've always had a kind of what I thought was a healthy relationship with food until that moment. And I remember just binging on junk for over a month and physically not being able to stop myself. And having the awareness at that moment to be like, why am I still eating this, yet still stuffing my face with a white chocolate Toblerone at the same time as having that conversation in my head? It was the most bizarre thing ever. So I think it's really, really good to see that transition over the years from no awareness, no talking about relationships with food to people like yourself, really, you know, carrying the trophy for it and educating people.
Thanks. Yeah, I think for some people it's a shock, right? So for me, it wasn't a shock because I'd already had disordered eating habits. I already kind of knew what binge eating was because I'd done it myself in the past. But I think I think it tends to be more in men that the men that I speak to who compete, they're like, no, I was pretty legit fine before I started competing, and it's more of a shock because you can't make sense of it because it's not some you're maybe in your mid-20s and you realise you've had a good relationship with food until now. What the hell is going on? Because you don't feel like you have control over it. Whereas for a lot of people who get into it to try and mask that, it just feels like, well, of course I still have this problem because I've always had it. But it's interesting to speak to people who actually didn't have any issues and then did find that competing or extreme dieting led to that.
So I think we've kind of discussed about poor relationship habits. But what would be like a red flag or a malpractice that would instantly, you would say, look, you know, you need to be careful of A, B, and C because this could lead to said eating poor behavior?
I mean, yeah, there are a lot of red flags, I think. There are certain things that exacerbate disordered eating and a lot of them are things that we can't avoid. So if we look at, there's certain research on bodybuilders which I think is interesting, right? Because they're an extreme case, but they show what happens when you extreme diet, and it's just what happens when you diet, but on a more extreme level. And things like regularly self-monitoring, so lots of body checking, lots of like weighing yourself every single day. For some people it's fine. Like, this is not, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will have a bad relationship with food, but it's kind of this kind of shit show, all of this stuff together that can be troublesome. But regularly checking yourself, like touching your skin, taking measurements, taking scale weight every single day, taking progress pictures every single week, and comparing week on week within every inch of your life. That regular self-surveillance is quite problematic. Having really rigid control. So there are two types of diet, and we can have like rigid dietary restraint or flexible dietary restraint. And it's not as simple as kind of quote unquote flexible dieting, but a lot of people know the difference between flexible dieting and a meal plan now, which is great. But if we have rigid control, we're more likely to have foods that we just don't have in house because we can't help but overeat them. So a diet plan that's like, you only have these foods to choose from and you can't deviate from that, that's a red flag. Or a diet plan that says you can deviate but only in your weekend off plan meal or only in your weekend cheat meal, a huge red flag, because it exacerbates what we call dichotomous thinking around food. So we end up having foods that are quote unquote good foods and quote unquote bad foods. And whenever we eat the bad foods, we feel guilt, we feel shame, we're more likely to overeat on them. And a lot of the time, coaches will just say, well, if you can't trust yourself around it, just don't have it in-house. And that's, again, another big red flag, because what that does is it triggers what we call the abstinence violation effect, which is a kind of thought process that was originally proposed for people with addictions. So alcoholics, people with alcoholism, etc. And it's this idea of when we create these quite strict rules for ourselves that say that we can't have something, i.e. a food, and then we finally like deviate from that and we give in and we allow ourselves to have it, we're more likely to feel bad, and we're more likely to have more of it because we have broken that rule, we violated that rule. And as we tell ourselves we can't have it, it's just like this big red button that we're waiting to push, and then we hit it and then everything goes to shit. And we fall into the self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, of course I was going to overeat on it. I always overeat on donuts, so I just shouldn't have them. And then we repeat the cycle again. So again, another red flag is this kind of brushing off of, well, just don't have that food, that's fine. The healthiest diets are ones where we are inclusive, flexible, and we give ourselves what we call unconditional permission to eat all foods. It doesn't mean that you do eat all those foods, but it means that if Susan brings in a cake and it's your favourite cake and it's a Tuesday afternoon at work, you say, I'm just going to allow myself this cake and then crack on with the rest of my day and let myself be 200 calories over, rather than I can't have that cake, think about it until Friday, and then find yourself balls deep in a full cake because you've waited for that long to have it. That's the difference.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting because over the years after my experience with that, I kind of organically fell into that process with my clients, because I realized and recognized that that was not a good place for me to be in. And it took me a long while actually to come out of the other end of not, constantly worrying about foods. And, when that's one of the main reasons why I competed, because stopped competing, because it became my whole being. Like, it wasn't just something that I did anymore. It was like, I am Dan, I am a competitor, I do like shows and everything, and nothing else matters. Like, everything was such to an extreme, and it just doesn't have to be. And I'm not bagging on competitors. It's just, for me personally, it literally just didn't work. Like, I took it to an extreme that wasn't healthy. But now whenever a client comes to me, I'm very aware of, let's do those things that you've been saying. Let's keep things flexible. Let's make sure that we don't put any foods on the pedestal, because that human psyche just wants, as soon as you say you can't have it, it's just like, okay. Or don't push the red button, or don't think of the pink elephant. It's literally, you have to do that as soon as it isn't available to you. I want it. And I think it's really interesting how, like, the conversation has now changed, because, like I said, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when we were competing, there was no awareness surrounding the relationships with food. There was no real conversation. Yeah, people were talking about like the post-comp blues, but they weren't really talking about what happened in terms of foods afterwards, and athletes that were gaining a stone and blowing up really quick in weight, and then they were miserable because they see themselves as these like elite athletes. And, now all of a sudden they've put on 10, 15 pounds of weight and body fat and water retention and inflammation and all those factors, and then are miserable again. So then they diet back down, same thing, they're over restrictive. And it just leads into this like spiral of just, I experienced it myself, after my first competition, I put on so much weight very quickly and was just instantly unhappy, because it wasn't like a normal return to like my set point. It was just bang straight away, because I was just overeating and ridiculously so. Like, I remember going in, because I hadn't had any sugar, I had like a bowl of Cocoa Pops, and I literally just couldn't stop. Like, I just had another bowl, and I just got to this point where I was like, oh, well, I might as well eat it all now. And I had the whole box of Cocoa Pops in one day. And I was just like, no, let's never, ever do this ever again. So we've already touched on it really, but how should we be thinking, as either clients, coaches, just everyday, the populace? How should we be thinking in terms of food, dieting, to avoid these kind of set patterns? Because humans love black and white stuff. We love, you can have this, you can't have this, you can do that, you can't do that. How do we get around that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. The first thing is that we have to learn to be imperfect with it. Stop trying to find perfection in your diet. Perfection is a perception. It doesn't exist anyway. My idea of perfect is different to your idea of perfect. It's different to someone else's idea of perfect. It doesn't exist. And so we're always striving for the completely unattainable, because it doesn't exist. And whenever we try and be perfect with our diets, it's impossible, right? We're going to fall off the wagon, so to speak, at some point. And if we don't
Mm-hmm.
come into this saying, I expect this to be imperfect, then we feel a lot of guilt around it. And that is when we get this kind of huge deviation of on the wagon or off the wagon, so to speak. And so let yourself make mistakes, but let yourself deviate. If your calorie target, say you're going to a diet and your calorie target is 1600 calories, say, okay, my target's about 1600, but do you know what, I can eat anywhere between 1450 and 1750 every day ish. As long as my daily average is 1600, I hit my protein, it doesn't really matter. And that's how I coach with my clients. So they have to have protein targets if they're tracking, and by the end of the week, if their average daily calorie intake is roughly where their daily target should be, I don't really care too much how they've hit it, as long as it's not huge deviations. If they've had more at the weekend or more during the week, I don't mind. And that's how we should be approaching it first and foremost. And I also think going into anything like this with the idea that this is a choice, you are choosing to diet, you are choosing to exercise, you're choosing to honour your body in the way that you are. You don't have to do anything. And the difference between saying I get to go to the gym today and I have to, is that you're more likely to enjoy it, but you're more likely to stick to it and you see better results. There's research that shows that actually some physiological adaptations to exercise actually happen more when you have the mindset of choosing rather than needing to or being forced to. So owning that your body, how you look after your body is your choice, but owning that anything that you do, whether it be dieting for health or aesthetic reasons or not dieting, whatever it is, owning that that's a choice that you are lucky enough to get to make, and not everyone in this world gets to choose to go on a diet for their holiday. And so I think going into it really with that mindset is super, super important. And then just kept always trying to keep perspective. So you're like me, right? You love sunsets and nature and stuff like that. One of the amazing things about nature is that when you get out in nature, you get this new perspective, or you just get some perspective. And when you take a step back and you have a donut and then you go for a walk, it's like, that was a donut. In the grand scheme of life, it was a donut. It's not going to change anything. It's probably not even going to change your progress. Like, let's be honest, a donut in a week. So, but when we're at home overthinking our food and stuck in our own head, we're like, oh my god, I've eaten a donut, I cannot believe I've eaten a donut, and we can tell ourselves these stories. So doing things that help you get perspective, and that might be getting out in nature, it might be having a social life, it might be journaling, but keeping the idea of this is a choice and I have to keep perspective, and realistically, how much does this really matter to my life? And I think sometimes people inflate it because they put their goals into their diet and their nutrition, and they put all of their focus into it. Like you were saying with bodybuilding, right? Bodybuilding, people often identify as bodybuilders, and I did this absolutely the same as you, because it's a hell of a lot easier to have a passion in bodybuilding than it is to accept that you're not fulfilled in other parts of your life, that your relationship is not yours, but like your relationship is crap or your job is crap and you don't enjoy other things. It's a lot easier to find it in diet and exercise. And if you feel like it's everything, then look at other parts of your life and be like, why is my body the most important thing? And again, that's just a bit of perspective, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would very definitely say that I resonate with that massively, because when I got into competing, it was kind of like the stepping stone from first going to the gym, but, you know, finding a new career as a personal trainer. And it was kind of like the landing pad and like leapfrog into more body confidence for me. So it was more about, okay, cool, I can do all this stuff. And I just had this kind of unhealthy expectation that the more perfect I was going to be, the better my results were. Now, obviously, years down the line, I recognize that that's complete bollocks and that's not how things work. But I was like, I don't want to step 1 foot out of line, because I want to get the best possible results, which are going to tie over into my confidence, make me feel better about myself, and I'm going to be able to help other people feel better about themselves. And it was it's something that really I'm so careful with now with myself. I have to check myself. I think everybody still is so guilty of falling into that perfection mindset all the time. Like we constantly expect the best of ourselves, and yet if it was our friends or family or whoever who had gone through something similar, we'd be the most supportive, kind, nurturing individuals. But then when it's ourselves, we're like, oh, you idiot, like you should not have done that. You know, you shouldn't have done that. And this voice inside my head and other people's heads when they go through that is not your friend. And something that I went through a couple of years ago, like I've been doing a lot of spirituality stuff. I've been doing a lot of therapy, a lot of research into psychology. And like one of the sessions, my therapist said to me, she was like, what do you do for like relaxing and self-care and nurturing? And I was like, easy. And she was like, okay, cool. What do you do? I was like, I go to the gym. I look after my body. I like go for walks. And she was like, Dan, let me just stop you there. No, what do you do to like calm and like nurture yourself? And it was just this moment where I was like, oh, okay, I've actually got this all wrong. Like I'm not doing a single thing to care for myself and to build up things except from like the external. And that's when I kind of found journaling. And she said to me as well, she was like, we're never aiming for perfection. And I've passed that on to my clients. We're not aiming for perfection at any one point. We're just aiming for progress. And that compounds over time. It's like, you know, when you're investing or, you know, anything in life, the power of the compound effect is huge. And it just means that little adaptations over a time is huge, whether that's knowledge, physical, mental, any of that. So in terms of perfection mindset, what are your kind of top tips to eliminate that? Because it's so easy to fall into.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about what you were saying about your therapist there is that is one of like the kind of things about compassion focused therapy is that we have these three systems, and one of the systems, like three systems that help or guide our emotional like our emotional state, and they are the threat system, the soothe system, and the drive system. And so often as perfectionists, we are focused on the threat and the drive system. So those are things that are like pushing us to achieve, pushing us towards success. And we forget about the soothe system. And when the other two are really dominant, it can lead to feelings of overwhelm, it can lead to feelings of anxiety, it can lead to feelings of depression. And often it can lead to things like emotional eating, because we are looking for quick fixes to make ourselves feel better. And so what your therapist was saying there when she was saying, you know, focus on the soothe system is what she was saying. What are your soothe things? That helps to regulate your systems a little bit and balance them out. And so you rely less on food, you rely less on those quick fixes, so to speak. So I think that is super, super important. And my mind's gone blank. What was the actual specific question? I just went off on a tangent. It doesn't happen very often.
No, it's fine. It was the perfection mindset and how we can not necessarily eliminate it, but be mindful of it and avoid falling into the trap.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know why that happened. I blame Friday brain. I would say like something that we use with our clients is, and something that one of my coaches actually got from her therapist, is actually programming in imperfection. And that might sound really odd, but you know, how would it feel to somebody if you said, right, you're going to do 9,990 steps today. You're not doing your 10,000 steps. Your goal is to do that. Or to say to somebody, right, you're going to show up 5 minutes late to meeting your mate tomorrow. You're always very punctual and you're always on time. Tomorrow you're going to be 5 minutes late. And actually challenging yourself to be imperfect, maybe not hitting your protein target one day, whatever it is, and noticing how it feels to do that, and noticing that the world doesn't end when you do it, that your friend doesn't, you know, end your relationship because you were late or whatever it may be. I think actively challenging yourself on that, and like you were sort of alluded to earlier, like being kind to yourself when you are imperfect, and recognizing that you are just human. And I think you need to figure out what perfectionism is serving for you, like what benefit is perfectionism having for you, what is your safety that you find in that. And usually we are looking for a sense of control, or we're looking for a sense of achievement that makes us feel like we're doing enough, because we don't inherently maybe feel that way without it. But we need to figure out what it is, what purpose it's serving for us, before we can then try and maybe meet that need somewhere else, so that we can let that perfectionism slip.
And I think it's really interesting as well when we're talking about self-compassion, because not too long ago you did a post and I just found it fascinating, because even though I have done a lot of work, I still, it's because I'm so new to the whole being compassionate to yourself and self-soothing. It's so challenging for me between having the compassion and then making an excuse. So you touched on it beautifully in a post not too long ago, and I'd love to go into a little bit more detail on that. So what is the difference between having self-compassion for yourself and making an excuse to not do something?
It's a good question. It's probably a question that most of my clients will ask me most weeks, one of our coaches anyway. And I think one of the key difference is that self-compassion helps you move forward and excuses hold you back. People think compassion is always just being kind to yourself, but it's actually not. Compassion is acknowledging a situation and accepting a situation for what it is, and then making a plan or making progress to move through it. There's an action part of compassion that people often forget, and you can think of it like one of the key researchers in self-compassion. She talks about like a yin and yang of self-compassion, and her name is Kristen Neff, if anyone wants to look her up. And she's, she says you have one part of it that is soft and kind and caring, and the other part that is proactive and a bit harder and is accountability. That's what self-compassion is. And it's the way that I implement it is saying, say you're going out for dinner and you're on a diet and you're checking in with your coach the next day. Making excuses in that situation would be, well, everyone else is peer pressuring me to eat this pizza. I feel like I should just fit in. I'm out. I'm just going to have a pizza. I've worked really hard today. I'm just going to have a pizza. It's fine. It is fine, right? But that would be making excuses. Whereas taking a compassionate choice would be, okay, I acknowledge that actually I probably don't really want the pizza that much. I acknowledge that tomorrow my future self will thank me for actually having a different option or only eating half of the pizza, as the case may be. And so I'm going to allow myself to have what I want in line with what's important to me, and then tomorrow I'll wake up and I'll feel proud that I did that, because it's moving you in the direction of what is important to you. It's not about anyone else. It's about saying you care about fat loss, or you care about your diet, whatever it is. So what is going to help you achieve what you want? That is the compassionate thing. Because I think people think, oh, well, no, I just want it. So being kind to myself is just having it. But do you know what? If you're in a larger body and your body fat levels are impacting your health, is eating the pizza the kindest thing for you because you want it? Or is actually saying, I'm only going to have half of it, or I'm going to have something else, is that actually kinder to you? And so I just think there's a misconception between it. So excuses won't get you anywhere, but compassion will. And actually, if you look at the research, people often think that self-compassion holds you back, but the research actually says that more compassionate people achieve more. They're more likely to keep going when they fail because they're kind to themselves, so they feel that they're worthy, so they'll keep trying harder. Whereas people who don't have that compassion, once they fail, and they're much less likely to get back up. So I think we just need to reframe it in our head, like compassion helps us be more successful, not less successful.
I read a book not too long ago, Internal Family Systems. It's a style of therapy. If you've not seen or read about it, read it. It's fascinating. And essentially in that, it talks about being calm, compassionate, collected. There's like 8 different C's. I can't remember them off the top of my head. But in there, it talks about compassion as in parenting yourself. That's kind of the way that it describes it, because it's, and like you've said, sometimes their compassion, it isn't just, if you had a child, you wouldn't give the child chocolate every single time that it wanted chocolate, or you wouldn't let it get away with anything just because you want it to be happy, because you've got to install values and be able to develop the child from, A to B, and make sure that it can live a healthy life. And I think that that's the way that at least I look at it, in terms of trying to be compassionate towards myself, because of the fact that for so long of my life, I've just got the blinkers on and like had zero self-compassion and care, and just been like, okay, I'm just going to like deal with all my emotions by either working or training or sports and just kind of powering through it. Then when I kind of had this moment of, okay, well now my therapist has just said I need to like back off and, slow down and like sit with any kind of uncomfortable emotion or whatever it might be. there was like kind of like a 6-month period where I was like, I don't know now, like if I'm just making excuses or if I'm genuinely being compassionate. So it was a real like kind of turning point, like a couple of years ago for me when I had that, because I was just like, well, yes, I need to make sure I'm aware of everything that's going on, and I'm like honoring any emotion, and I'm being aware of everything that's going on. But also as well, I don't want it to negatively affect my work or anything else that's going on. So it was a real juggling act. And I think lots of people kind of struggle with that. And I think it's, at least for me, just because it was such a parallel to what I was doing. It was a massive jump from one to the other. I felt like it was kind of like almost a mixed message from me. I think just because of the way my brain perceived it, because I was trying to like categorize it and put it in a box of, okay, cool, well, self-compassion is this. But it's so difficult with anything in coaching, like it doesn't matter what avenue. The thing that I always say to my clients is, well, it depends. And it's the most frustrating answer to get as a human, because we just want that, okay, this is what you have to do to get this result. And it never works like that, does it?
Yeah, I hate it too, because you're right, so much does depend. And it's really tough because it's like, one of the issues with disordered eating and relationships with food is that one habit for someone might be healthy, and the exact same habit for someone else might be really detrimental to their life. So it's like, an example of this would maybe be, is it okay to save all my calories for later in the day when I'm busy at work and I don't really eat much? And for someone who has a family life and wants to eat with their family and is busy at work, that might be great. Like, yeah, let's make that work. But for someone who regularly overeats and restricts all day and then overeats at night and is in quite a vicious cycle with that, that's one of the worst things that you can do. So the answer, you're right, is so much it depends, and which is why the self-awareness side of it is so important, that you understand why you are eating the way that you are and why you are training the way that you are and why you think the way that you do. Because how can you apply any of the stuff that, you know, you talk about or I talk about unless you understand your own way of thinking?
Yeah, it's so difficult as well, because I remember thinking before I did any therapy, I was like so arrogant and egotistical. But I remember thinking as I went, I was like, I'm really interested and excited to explore therapy. But I remember thinking, I'm pretty self-aware. In fact, I think in my first like 5 minutes of that first therapy session, I think I even said the words, I am pretty self-aware. And then literally she must have just like chuckled like behind like the clipboard. But yeah, I was just so ignorant. I was not self-aware at all. I thought I was. And it was just, I genuinely believe, I think if everyone had the opportunity, they should go and do some form of therapy at least once in their life, if they have the option to. I mean, I know not everyone has the ability to in terms of finances, but it's been so life-changing. Even if you don't struggle with what you would kind of constitute mental health illness, just to develop that self-awareness and an understanding of yourself, I think is so important.
I absolutely agree, and think it's hard because a lot of people don't have access to it, and which is, I'm the same as you. Like, I'm mindful of saying, you know, everyone should get it, but if you're really struggling, you can usually get referred through your GP. There's a website, it's like IAPT, that you can self-refer in the UK. But yeah, it can be transformative. But if you can't, just journaling, and Google has tons of journal prompts. I'll sometimes put some out, and actually just trying to get into a habit of journaling. Nobody loves to do it initially. Nobody finds it super comfortable initially. But journaling is one of the greatest ways that you can become more self-aware.
Yeah, I've been journaling for the last 2 years, and journaling and meditation for me have been like transformative in terms of self-awareness, because up until that point, my brain is so active. Like, I'm always thinking about ideas, or like I just really struggle to turn off. And the only time that I genuinely like switch off is meditation, yoga, or when I'm like journaling, because then I'm so like present on the task at hand that it's just, there's nothing else. And I remember, I think this is my first yoga session. This is going to sound so hippie, but it's coming out anyway. But my first yoga session, I remember like after we were doing the breathing and started doing some of the poses, like my head got all like tingly and I was like really relaxed. If you've ever had like a head massage, it was kind of like that sensation. And then afterwards, I just remember like being so relaxed and chilled out. I was like, wow. I was like, I need this more. So now I've tried to keep that in.
Yoga is definitely like that. I'm like that every time I do it. Afterwards, I feel like I've just had a massage, but it takes me a lot to then actually then the next time go, right, okay, I'm going to go again, because the idea of it is never great, but afterwards you always feel fab.
So Emilia, thank you for coming on. What is next for you over the next few months?
Oh, it's $1 million question. Not that I'm going through a crisis at the moment. For me, so I run an online education course, so with Emma Story Gordon, and so we are that's growing a lot at the moment. So my focus is a lot on educating other personal trainers around this stuff and growing my coaching team probably a little bit more. But personally, I'm going through some fertility stuff, so I'm freezing down some of my eggs, which is very exciting. And so that's probably enough to take over my whole life for at least a couple of months, because it's a lot of hormones. So I'll be a delight to be around anyone for the next couple of months. And that's it.
Yeah. Perfect. And where can everyone find a little bit more about
Instagram is Emilia Thompson PHD, and my website is emilia.fitness. So any of those places.
And I always like to finish it off with kind of a message that you would like to share with the listeners.
I missed that question, sorry.
So I'd like to finish every episode off with just a final message for the listeners. So what would the message be that you'd like to share?
Good question. I would say give yourself a break and keep everything in perspective. Life is much easier when you're not being a dick to yourself. And realistically, is it going to matter in 5 minutes, 5 weeks, 5 months, or 5 years? And if it's not, then let it go.
That's good. I like that. I'm going to take that on as well. Anyway, thank you so much. And we finally got this sorted after like weeks of Wi-Fi issues and technology issues. And
we made
it's finally been done.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem.